Hello, everyone, and welcome to New Signature's Azure Site Recovery webinar, Recovery Backup and Business Continuity. We appreciate you joining us today. We're just going to go over a couple housekeeping items, and then we'll turn it over to Michael. Today, the webinar is being recorded. We will be sending out a follow-up email post this event with the recording so that you are able to watch in the future. Additionally, Q&A will take place at the end of the webinar. However, you can feel free to place questions in the chat window at any time, and we will get to those. I'm going to turn it over now to our solution architect, Michael Trachtenberg. Thank you again.
Yeah, and hi, good morning, everyone. This is Michael Trachtenberg. I'm a solutions architect with New Signature, and I'll be talking to you today about the backup, recovery options, how do we go about that, and why it's important in our organizations. When we first start to talk about things like disaster recovery or recovery in general, or even the idea around high availability. I mean, all of those things we all as IT professionals understand that they're of critical nature to us, right? We have to have a disaster recovery plan for our data, for our servers, for the information that we all manage. When we typically need to do that, obviously it comes into a whole host of different challenges, right? We have challenges that identify themselves around different technologies that are needed to actually execute those types of backup services or disaster recovery type services or high availability services, right? So we might have things like data center software management solutions like System Center, or we might have backup or backup to disk, and then offshore backup to tape, offsite backup to tape, or we might have we might be doing it at the more of like a hardware level where we have individual like EMC storage nodes in different geographic locations, and we're doing storage level replication for business continuity. And maybe you're doing that for your VMware environment, or you're doing it for a Hyper-V environment and just replicating the disk over. Or maybe you're using Veeam, or you're using VMware's vMotion or things like that in order to kind of build this scenario for business continuity, or or maybe you're doing this in the case of just in case for disaster in a disaster incident. So when we look at the challenges, it's trying to find the right solutions. It's trying to make sure that those solutions can fit into all of your technology ecosystem, right? VMware, Hyper-V, Linux, everything that you have in your environment. And if you do also want to leverage some cloud resources, well, how do we back that up, and how do we plan for some type of the outage or incident with that too, right? So if you want to use cloud resources, you have to plan for those as well. So lots of different challenges that we need to meet with those technologies that at times we have a lot of them to choose from. So when we get more into specific, not just from an availability standpoint, but in the case that if we are planning more specifically for a disaster, and there is some type of recovery process that has to go into play there, what does that process look like? Is that process documented? Has that process been tested and vetted? And can we actually put our finger on it and prove that we know this is going to work in the case of a specific incident? A lot of times we'll go through the effort of ensuring we have systems in place that are going to support us in the case of a disaster, but and we have them. Sometimes we even have those documented. A lot of times when you're working with clients, you want to be able to provide to them your disaster recovery plan, right? They say, this is for all the data that that we have of yours in our organization, this is our DR plan for if anything was to happen. But when was the last time you tested that plan or vetted that plan or ensured that that plan worked? And if you do test that plan, even if you go above and beyond where a lot of other organizations are, and you're actually able to test it and you actually do your validation, and you've gone through this before, what was that level of effort like? It's quite substantial to have your main data center and then have a secondary, colo location or colo data center, and build up your DR strategy, document it, have your plan, and then actually execute the DR plan on a quarterly or 6-month basis. I mean, that is a tremendous amount of effort that most organizations don't get to all of those different components. So a lot of the reasons that we find all of these things important and why you should go through that extensive level of effort is actually because data centers do experience outages. I mean, that's just the nature of it. These are things where there's still mechanical components moving somewhere in there, and things fail, or buildings lose power. All of these things do typically happen. And, on averages, most data centers are going to have, even the very, very well-run ones are going to have 3 or more outages a year. And obviously preparing for DR in that case, that you're going to be ready for those things. All things considered, the amount of downtime for those outages is probably pretty low. 1.4 hours really. That's not a lot of time in the whole course of a year, but of course that happens at the most inconvenient times, as so it goes, right? And there's there's lots of costs that go into that. There's cost into that amount of downtime, and there's cost that goes into obviously the upkeep of all of these systems that you have ready and prepared for and in place, just to prevent the case of those 3 small outages that account to 1 hour or so of downtime. So what is the solution? What is the solution for all of these things? Well, when we start to get into how do we make a lot of this easier, Microsoft is really betting and kind of investing in Azure in order to give you a platform to kind of alleviate a lot of the major issues and concerns and the problems with building a highly available, highly resilient, easy-to-use DR solution that really becomes an extension of your environment. Let's see, there's some note, someone's having an issue seeing it. Is anyone else having an issue seeing the presentation? I can share it a different way. That's better. Okay, all right, good, we're set. Okay, so what Microsoft is trying to do is bring all of this under one platform, right? This way you can do backups, you can do these DR sites, you can have a single point for things to fail over to, where you can then ensure that everything is running in that environment. And we want to make this easy for your environment that is obviously coming from a mix of all different providers, right? You can have VMware, Linux, VMware hosts with VMware machines, Linux running inside that VMware environment. Obviously, physical servers, non-physical servers, Hyper-V machines. Server 2008, Server 2012, 2016, all of those different things. Those all need to be part of this solution, and it needs to work and integrate with those seamlessly. And that's really one of the other major items that the Microsoft Azure recovery services really tries to do, is try to keep all of those together and give you the ability to implement their solutions on all of those things without having to second guess, like, oh, is this going to work? Or is it going to support my entire environment? So one of the other things is this makes it easy to use that platform and use other services inside of that platform as well. So when we break this down into the 2 main components here, when we're talking about ASR, it kind of falls into 2 buckets, where we have the idea around which ASR stands for, Azure Site Recovery. So the idea behind this is that it's a solution that is going to give you business continuity in the case of a disaster. And then there's the actual backup of your data. right? So it can be a backup of VMs, it could be backup of blob or other large data sets, or even just your typical backup, right? If you're backing up the disk now or backing up the tape, doing that same thing where really Microsoft's cloud becomes offsite storage for you. It's very typical that we find a number one replacement for tape is just moving, which is essentially still an offsite backup where it's just going into a vault somewhere. It's just going into Microsoft's data center, so it's still essentially the same thing, but at a fraction of the cost. So we break it into two areas where we have your business continuity, disaster recovery, and failover of your running systems. All that falls under Azure Site Recovery, and then you have the actual backup and restoration of your data and the offsite storing, which is under Azure Backup. What is the retention? There's a question. What is the retention limit for backup into Azure Backup? And that is 99 years. So you can back up data into Azure for 99 years. So I think that should be sufficient for most of us. So the real part of the solution is these two things working together, right? So it's disaster recovery in the case of something, something on-premise was to fail, or your environment, your entire on-premise environment was to fail, have it automatically up and running in Azure within a few moments' notice. So how do these things work? What can we really do with them? Well, the way that it all starts to come together is we actually would integrate these. We would integrate the ASR services into the VMware environment, into a Hyper-V environment, and also on your physical servers. And those actual resources would be replicated on a block level and with synchronous replication to Microsoft's Azure cloud environment. And that can be done from the host levels, it can be done from physical machines, and it can also be done on individual server basis. These servers then are going to be replicated continuously to Microsoft's cloud services. You could even do this from AWS or other cloud service providers or Rackspace or anything like that. These machines are going to be replicating constantly. So there's going to be an initial replication, and then there's going to be micro-level replications. Once, in the case that a disaster does come into effect, the machines will automatically come live in Azure, and then the ones on-prem, once they've come back, it's going to synchronize the changes back down. Obviously, from a DR sense, you could see why this would be very, very useful. But from even a migration sense, it's very useful. So if you wanted to move machines from one data center to another, you can do that. If you wanted to move machines up into Azure permanently, you can do that here as well. All right. So just to get into a little bit more of how it actually works, is we have Azure Site Recovery services that are hosted in Azure, and you have your on-premise data center, your racks, or maybe even it's in a third-party hosting environment, right? What we would install, configure the Azure Site Recovery services, install agents on VMs, whatever or directly integrate into the virtual host. Now we also set up we're showing it as a VPN or express route connection into Azure. These express route or VPN connection is used so that obviously in the case of a failover or something was to happen to one of the VMs on-premise, then your on-premise users and resources can connect directly to the Azure servers that are being spun up once the failover has taken place. So the VPN is pretty critical. We can also take this step further, where we can deploy additional services in Azure that are already waiting for your machines in the event of a failover. Things like having a domain controller in Azure is a really great strategy. Having that domain control there is important because as machines then, in the case of a disaster, if things fail over and all of your machines your users are redirected towards the Azure site, if you have a DC rating there already for them, They can automatically start to use services. It also will reduce the time to live of all of your services that are getting spin up over there. All right. So some of the other things to keep in mind too is building a good plan for what to do in the case of a disaster, and then also validating that plan. One of the crucial benefits of ASR also is that you can use this to do cold testing, right? So when we talked earlier, we were mentioning how it's great to have all of this stuff if you're trying to do it all on-prem or with on-prem in a co-location or a data center that you're renting space on. But then you actually have to execute that failover, and that could be quite cumbersome. But with ASR, it can actually encapsulate the machines that are in Azure into a cold state, and you can do testing and validation for failover against that anytime that you'd like. So you can test failover into cold environments. You can do a hot test for failover and fail back, all within just a few clicks, actually. So it makes it quite easy to do that. So right there, testing it failover. All right. So yeah, so having all of the connections ready to go, people being able to connect to Azure in the case of an actual disaster is quite easy for you to take advantage of that. So when you can start to kind of like think about this a little bit differently, where now you can say, all right, well, it's great that we can do that. We can obviously use this as a form of disaster recovery for machines, right? Because the machines are being replicated, but what else can we do with it, right? So yes, it is a DR service, and the machines are going to spin up because it's once the machine on-premise has failed or something has happened to it. But also we can use this as a form of migration. We can move things to Azure this way. So if we wanted to, let's say we had a co-location, right? We have an offsite secondary data center where we're renting data center space, and we have 30 VMs there. And maybe these are non-critical VMs, or you ran out of storage space in your main data center, and you're also using as your backup place because it's a secondary location. You can move all of that to Azure. You can use ASR to migrate those 30 VMs up into Azure, and then you can do all of your backups into Azure as well. And obviously, if you do those things, you can get rid of that co-location. It's no longer needed or required anymore. So obviously, it could be a tremendous amount of cost savings there for you. All right. So one of the other pretty cool things too, if I'm just build this out a little bit, is if you actually wanted to do any type of dev testing, or even, it doesn't even have to be an official, like you have a dev testing department, but let's say you have, a small SharePoint farm, or you have, some type of financial software, and you said, okay, it's great that we have this, we're using it, and you wanted to, maybe you want to test what it would look like to run some new application against it, or you want to test, validate, and upgrade for that particular software, or you want to take a snapshot of an environment and put it into a sandbox and go ahead and execute some new code or validate something against it. Well, you can use ASR for that because it can be used as a migration software, migration tool as well. You can take those 3 or 4 machines. You can use Azure Site Recovery to move them into another data center or move them up into Azure, basically replicating them, put them in a little sandbox, do your testing or validation, and then throw it away when you're done. Or if you like what the outcome of that is you can have that replicate back the delta changes to your on-premise environment. Right? So this can be used as a tool to sandbox snippets of your environment, and make changes to them and then replicate back. So lots of, alternate usages for ASR. So when we start to look at, what this thing can do, it actually can do a lot. It can do a lot that goes beyond just making sure that your machines are safe and giving you peace of mind in that regard. It can become a tool for other areas where you might not have thought about it previously. So things like automated replication for your VMs to make sure that they're protected and can fail over. It has a very quick RTO time or RPO time for getting machines up and running again. Planned or unplanned failover, all possible with even the possibility of doing permanent failover, right? So that means, actually a migration. Yes, it can do failback and sync the changes back. The idea of doing actual DR tests or testing that failover, and you can test it into sandbox environments. Obviously, again, migrating VMs to Azure, and again, doing some dev testing. Doing copies of small portions of the environment and putting them in locations so that you can, use them and test against them. All right, so now we're going to move into the other side of the equation, which is the actual backups, right? So these backups are quite substantial, and they give a lot of options here as well too. So when we start to actually talk about the backup component, this can be very straightforward, or you can make it much more complex. It can be something simple where you have just an agent that sits on a machine and it's executing file level backups, right? And it's going to do everything you think the typical backup can do. You're going to set what the backup schedule is, what it's going to back up, when it's going to back it up, what the backup target going to be, Azure, right? What type of storage are you backing those things up into? And it gives you the ability to set retention policies and retention tags and how long you're going to keep that data in Azure. And you can, say, back up data every day, keep a differential, once every 2 weeks, and then save that the 2-week backup for 99 years, right? So you can have this do all of those things, execute all of those backups, and then obviously you can do your file level restores or the machine level restores at that point. With this too, you have the ability to also integrate into other solutions such as System Center, or even put an Azure Backup server on premise. And the difference between the server and the agent is the server is going to do, machine state or OS state backups, as well as be able to integrate into specific software to give you application level backups, right? So we're talking about things like SQL, where you can do SQL database level backups and then do SQL database level restores and things of that nature. So the backup, really, the main thing why we see people using that is to do away with tape. I mean, if we look at like this is the graph for the capacity, right? So how much data you're going to be storing, and that directly correlates the cost, right? The more that you store, the more it costs you, and that's just how much it is. And with tape, there's the added cost of the more you store, the more tapes that you have to buy, the more tapes you have to manage, the more tapes you have to store, the more expensive that becomes. So this is as no-brainer as it gets with just replacing just tape with these backups. So how does it, how it actually works? Well, again, there's an agent-based component one where you can do file level backups. Those agents are placed onto can be placed inside the operating system environment, and then the backups take place. If you have machines, so this is if you have a machine in Azure already, that entire machine state can be backed up as well, and you can set a policy at the Azure level to say to back up this machine. If you want to back up the machine state of machines on-prem, you can do that as well, and that is done with, again, a backup server or integrating into Data Protection Manager. Right? There's just a little bit more of showing like the process on how the backup works. So this kind of goes in line with the two different methods, right? So we have the agents that are installed, and there's the backup agent, and it's going to back them up directly into Azure, or it's going to work in conjunction with the backups. All right, so that's a little bit of the Microsoft technologies and the strategies for ASR and for backup. So just wanted to go quickly over what New Signature does to kind of complement that. And obviously, what we do, we're focused on delivering great customer experiences. And when we talk about specifically ASR and backup, we want to help you get up and running with these technologies to see as you've learned today too, there's lots of ways that you can use it aside from, oh, it just is doing protecting my VMs. It has other use cases. So we'd like to kind of show you that, show you how those things function and operate, and show you, what else you can really do with these services to get a little bit more out of it than just backup or recovery. So for New Signature, we cover a whole host of different Microsoft technologies and pretty much everything underneath the Microsoft sun, with the exception of ERP systems. When we started to go through, when we started to look at ASR and these services, we also came up with the idea of doing this more as a service, where we help organizations implement things like ASR and backup, and then we help to manage it for you. And from there, we monitor the ASR services, we monitor the Azure services, we monitor the agents that are on-prem doing the replication. We do the failover testing, both sandbox and hot and cold testing for you, and give you reports on a quarterly basis or 6-month basis to indicate, this is how all of your services are running, and to validate that you are indeed protected, and we've validated that your DR plan is ready to enact at a moment's notice. So we go a little bit above and beyond, and that's kind of why we came up with this idea of DR as a service, where we're basically taking all of those components that are already possible with ASR and backup and turning that into a service for you. When we go through that, we actually built out what we call runbooks, where we go through how your organization is currently operating, and then ensure that it's going to operate the same way in the case of a disaster. Again, using those Microsoft technologies as a means to do that. So this is just the same slide before. So but kind of walking through it again is, we would be able to monitor that replication traffic, help you set up and configure your VPN gateways and your connection to Azure, help configure those Azure recovery services. If you're going to be integrating with, VMware or any other services in your organization, we would help to set up and configure that as well. So just an overview of what we offer there. Again, setting it all up, doing those testing and validation, giving you reports on its current state, and making sure that you're always ready to go for those. So just some of the other services that New Signature does have to offer. Again, we have managed services around that, as well as, if you just wanted someone to help you get up and running with site recovery, we can most certainly do that. Microsoft has a lot of funding incentives as well. So, they have dollars and they have programs for helping an organization, test or validate or do a POC on ASR to see how these things could work for them. All right, so I know we have just about 1 or 2 minutes left, so we can do some quick Q&A, see if there's anything in here. All right, so there was one, can we do a DR exercise as well? Yes, you can. And will the machines re-IP themselves in a failover? Yes, they will. And so that's when we're setting up the Azure component, we can set up the subnets to mirror your on-premise environment, and we can have the machines re-IP themselves with the correct IP following a failover. All right, any other questions or anything else that we can do for you today?
Great. Thank you, Michael. If you could switch to the last slide for me. Thank you so much for joining us today. If anyone has questions post this event, feel free to. We did put the slide up on the screen here for you. It is info@newsignature.com. We will be sending the recording out, and we look forward to seeing you on future events. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone.